Welcome everyone to the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. My name is Marisa Gomez. I run our community programs here at the museum. Really excited to have you all here for Naturalist Night. This is a series that we've been doing for years and years and years, but it's also kind of had a bit of a hiatus because some things happened in our community a couple years ago that sort of changed the way that we wanted to do lectures and things like that. But we're really hoping to get back into the swing of having regular gatherings here at the museum with experts to share more in depth about the work they do. We also do lots of programs here at the museum. Has anyone who's first time at the museum today? Never been here before? A couple of you? First time inside? Yeah. Have you been on the whale before?
I've done like 10 walks.
Yeah. So we do a lot of stuff outside. Last week we did our first Friday, which was all about fire too, part of this series. And that's just like a free-for-all, come hang out, free admission, open till 8, and there's stuff in the park. A lot of our partners who are here today were there for that event too. So there's always things going on. We hope to have you engage with all of our different types of programs. And tonight's program is part of a series called CZU and You, which is something that we launched really shortly after the fires of the CZU Lightning Complex in August of 2020. So we're experiencing our 3-year anniversary since that event. And as we gather here today, fire is really big in the news today for devastating events that are happening on Maui, and it's just a constant for our life as we know it now. And so we find that it's really important to help people put these major community events in context, both understanding that they have been very traumatic for our community. I'm sure some of you were directly touched by those fires, but fire is also a natural part of the landscape here. And so trying to navigate our current existence in this community, living in the wildland-urban interface, having communities that are expanding into these wild spaces, and also understanding that fire is an important part of how our local ecology is the way that it is. And so tonight, what we're really wanting to do is dig into that side of the story and hear about what local groups are doing to answer some of these questions and to get good fire back on the landscape, both at the really, really large scale with some really huge properties, and then also zooming into kind of the resident level and understanding that every plot of earth here in the Santa Cruz Mountains and in Santa Cruz County and in this region is part of our mosaic of habitats, and we all have a role to play. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We've got a series of speakers. We're going to start with Rick Flores, who's going to help represent the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and talk about Indigenous connections to fire here locally. We'll move on to Dylan McManus from Cowell Redwoods State Park, talk about the work that State Parks is doing at that particular site. Ian Robotham from Sempervirens Fund, who's going to be talking specifically about San Vicente Redwoods and the work happening there. Laurel from the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County is going to be talking about more like the resident level. And then Jared Childress from the Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association is going to be talking about the work that community members can and are doing through that organization. So I'm going to be inviting each of the speakers up to give short little talks. And after each speaker, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask specific questions of that person. So like 1 or 2 questions. And then we'll be moving on to the next speaker. And then at the very end, we're going to have everyone come back up here and there'll be more time for questions. So keep that in mind. If you have like a burning question that's very relevant to what you just heard, there will be an opportunity to ask it right then, but you can also hold on to it and ask it at the end. And we're hoping that this is somewhat of a conversation. And on that note, I'll also just say that this is part of a series that we're doing, CZU and You. And so we're doing walks throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains and in the burn zone every weekend this month. And a lot of them, some of them have passed, some of them are full, but there's still room in our final walk of the series, which is going to be at the Upper Fall Creek unit of Henry Cowell Redwoods State Park. And that one is going to be really great. It's part of our an ongoing series that we do outside of this month called Fall Creek After Fire. And so if after this you're inspired to go out into the landscape and continue talking about these topics, you can sign up for that. It's a free walk. So I'm going to now hand things over to Rick Flores, who is the Assistant Director of the UC Santa Cruz Arboretum, and he's also an associate for the Amah Mutsun Land Trust with a long history of supporting the tribe and their work here in this region. So please help me welcome Rick Flores.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Waswa-speaking Weepi tribe. The Amah Mutsun tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know of indigenous burning prior to contact, and forgive me for reading. I'm used to giving much longer talks about this, and so with just a few minutes, I wanted to be sure that I was concise with my words. And the pictures that you're seeing here are pictures that I've been involved with the Amah Mutsun on different cultural burns, San Vicente Redwoods, Pinnacles National Park, and then some pictures of some relearning practices where tribal members were relearning how to start fires in the traditional ways with hand drills and fireboards. For millennia, the indigenous people here on the Central Coast regularly stewarded and managed the land with fire. Fire was the most significant, efficient, effective, and widely used vegetation management tool used by California Indian tribes. They burned both small patches and extensive tracts of vegetation in systematic fashion. These burning practices sustained ecosystems like coastal prairies and oak woodlands, altered the structure and composition of plant communities, and enhanced biological diversity and the availability of native plant cultural resources. Today, we believe that coastal prairies were burned every 3 to 5 years in a rotational cycle, and that oak woodlands and redwood forests were burned every 7 to 15 years based on ethnographic and scientific evidence. This frequency was likely due to how much fuel there was on the ground to actually carry the fire forward. Burning was so extensive here on the Central Coast that the first overland expedition by the Spanish into this area in October of 1769 recorded in their journals that they chose their campsites based on where they could find unburned pasture for their horses. Indigenous burning was different than when we think of fire today. Fires were often started in the fall, and because the landscape was burned regularly, there wasn't a lot of fuel on the ground, and so indigenous burning was low intensity and slow moving. Without indigenous burning, the early European explorers would have encountered a land with less spectacular wildflower displays, fewer large trees and park-like forests, and the coastal prairies might not have existed in the first place. Beyond using fire as a tool for vegetation management, Chairman Lopez has described fire as a gift from their creator. It has kept trail routes open so communities and families could gather together. It cooked their food, kept them warm, and delivered prayers to the creator. Today, the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and their partners, many of which are in the room today, are working to bring indigenous fire back to our landscapes and ecosystems. And so what this really does, is it challenges our notions of wilderness in this country. John Muir, who's the father of our conservation movement, he brought these ideas to North America, and it basically separated humans from the environment. And what we know now is that through these fire practices, the native people were changing the composition of plant communities and sustaining ecosystems. So what was found here at the time of contact was not a wilderness. It was a land that had been tended and stewarded for thousands of years by native people. And so this knowledge has relevance today. It deserves a place at the table, along with our Western scientists and partners, to help steward our lands and bring back native plant cultural resources to our landscape. So thank you.
So thanks, Rick, for that introduction and welcome for tonight's presentation. We are going to bring up our first formal presentation on this topic, which is Dylan McManus. And Dylan McManus is one of the interpreters at Cowell Redwoods State Park. And he's been a wonderful partner of the museum on programming at that site, as well as helping the community connect with actual, like getting their hands on getting good fire back into the landscape. So please help me in welcoming Dylan. Get this going. Who's this? Sorry. I can't see it on this one, but I feel like I can get it out of the way, maybe. Maybe not. All right, you guys are just gonna have to accept it and that it's up there. All right.
Thanks for that introduction, Marisa. It's an honor to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And it's quite an exciting time because we're able to learn from and partner with Indigenous communities and understand how the use of fire as a stewardship tool creates a more resilient and healthier forest. And even though that partnership is happening with state parks and agencies like the Amah Mutsun Tribal Band, RCD, who's here this evening, for larger scale projects. I'm going to speak a little bit about some small scale projects that are happening in the Redwood Grove of Cowell Redwoods State Park. And this is a public facing sort of small scale project. And by that, I mean, it's open to the public. So anyone is welcome to sign up for these efforts that I'm going to be talking about and participate in some forest management. Exciting that it's a way to involve the community. Okay, the first thing I think that's important to mention is that the return interval of fire just north of us, so this is the forests between Davenport and Naga Nuevo, has a median of 40 years. And by return interval, I just mean the frequency at which the landscape experiences fire, as Rick told us, with cultural influence. A little bit further south where Cowell Redwoods State Park is situated, 4 to 15 years. And so needless to say, fire is an integral part of the California landscape, thanks to our geography, our Mediterranean climate. Mediterranean climates have very warm and dry summers and very wet and cold winters. And with those conditions, they're quite suboptimal for rot. And so debris simply does not have the conditions that it needs in order to break down and rot. Fungus can't grow in those conditions. And so I'm sure we've all heard this, redwoods drop a huge amount of debris, and when that happens, it doesn't go anywhere. And as a species, redwood wood is very difficult to rot in general. And so, where California is situated, we're in a spot where there's the perfect fuel load for wildfires to happen. And so in an area that should be experiencing frequent wildfires, a redwood forest should look relatively like this. And the forest structure here is quite open, it's breathable, there's kind of a diversity of age between the trees. In the background here, you can see a dead snag way in the back. That's going to act as habitat for certain species. There's the occasional rotting log on the forest floor and very diverse understory. When you remove fire from an area that has evolved with it, such as California, and since the colonial era, public policy was to suppress fire, you receive a redwood forest that looks like this. So night and day difference, a huge testament to the fact that this debris doesn't go anywhere, it just accumulates on the forest floor. And so the efforts I'm going to be talking about today are manual efforts to try and create a more resilient redwood forest ecosystem for the future. So we want to turn this landscape into something that looks a little more similar to this. Yeah, and the last time this happened at Cowell Redwoods State Park was in 2009, 2010. We can see some residual brush piles here that evidently were not ignited. Again, testament to the fact that this material doesn't go anywhere. There's one in the forefront here of the image, and there's one in the back. We're approaching 14 years, and these piles haven't gone anywhere. So that's very that's an unnatural process. Okay, so these efforts involve the creation of brush piles. We see a few brush piles in the image on screen here. And we also have a gentle reminder of the general forest structure that we should be seeing in an old growth redwood forest here. All of these efforts that are currently underway are manual efforts. So we're not using any heavy machinery. We're doing everything by hand to create these brush piles. Here's another picture. There's many different ways to create brush piles at the park. We're organizing these and structuring them very similar to a campfire. You can think of small kindling type material in the center with larger debris on the outside, and the kindling will ignite the larger debris, and it will slowly collapse on itself. Often when larger debris is on the bottom and you ignite the pile, then the debris on top will fall on top of the larger debris and insulate it, which means that staff has to stay on site for a longer period of time to monitor it. So these are structured in a way that's a very fast burn. Here's a video showing generally what the efforts look like. We can see a lot of, it's kind of hard to make it out here, but the trunks of wood here is bay laurel. There's a lot of laurel foliage in the background. And so our, efforts look a lot like this. They're very timely and arduous. And I'm gonna, and that's the final, that's what we want to end with. And again, we're not removing all of the material. A lot of, like the material in the foreground here is great habitat for many different species. So we're not going to clean everything. We want to leave some debris to rot and become like, that's an important character of the forest structure. So we're leaving those. I think the rule of thumb is generally exceeding 8 inches. We want to leave that. Here's another time lapse. You can see the brush pile creation as well as the ignition, which we'll see in about 30 seconds here. It's worth mentioning that these efforts there's minimal staff on site. So this is largely being done by park volunteers as well as community members who sign up for these efforts. And so a huge applaud for all the folks who are doing this. On May 9th, we ignited, I think, 60 brush piles, which again were exclusively made manually and largely by park volunteers and community members. And to date, we have another, I think we're at 35. We're hoping to make another 25 before the onset of the next rainy season. Also worth mentioning that redwood is very, it doesn't combust very well. So when you ignite it, there's not a lot of combustion. And so that's one way that helps these piles sort of just collapse on one themselves and, creates a more controlled introduction of, or reintroduction rather, of fire into the redwood forest. And so here we have a before and after image of a forest that doesn't really receive any management on the left here, and then a forest that receives light management in the form of brush pile creations on the right. So quite a big difference. To circle back on this public facing opportunity, we partnered with the museum here last Saturday, and folks were able to hang out with the park rep, talk a little bit about fire ecology, and at the end of their walk, plug right into a brush pile creation workday. In my opinion, it was a huge success. We had created about 6 piles by the end of the workday. It was really fantastic. Folks seem to have enjoyed it quite a bit. And it's good work. So we're looking for additional partners, organizations and agencies to team up with to do this. And we're going to keep offering this to the public. So if you think you might be interested in lending a helping hand, you can certainly sign up And a gentle reminder, we're not only reducing the fuel load to keep our communities safe and avoid catastrophic possibilities of catastrophic wildfire events, but we're also creating suitable habitat for a lot of organisms in the redwood forest. I'm going to really speed through this last part. I want to talk just a tiny bit about adaptations for fire tolerance, because many of the resident organisms in the redwood forest are very, very okay with fire. Burl tissue is a great example of adaptation. Many tree species have what's called root collar burl. This is just an aggregation of bud tissue that sprouts when something is disturbed. So disturbance can be, in the case of this picture, it can be a breakage, or it can be something like fire. And so that means that the above ground mass of the plant is, it can experience that kind of disturbance, and it will be okay. The tissue will sprout, it'll be activated. Here on the right, we see these small little orbicular type patterns. That's the actual buds that sprout. And then next we have rhizomes. That's a root structure. Many of the plants that live in the redwood forest have rhizomatic roots. And this, we can think of this as like a subterranean like lateral stem. So it's a growing part of the plant, but it's underground. And so it's safely insulated during fire events. And so when a fire comes through here, boom, it's activated, it'll sprout. We have sorrel and ginger here. And this is one of my favorite images. Here on the left, we have sorrel. On the right, we have stream violet. Both of these have rhizomatic root structures, and they're growing in the burn scar from the brush piles that were ignited on May 9th. So you can see the charcoal there. And so these things are rebounding because the root structures are safely insulated. And then same root structure for lots of different ferns. This is a bracken fern. We can see a frond there growing. It's really, really beautiful to see. This patch of ginger almost doubled since we kind of focused the gingers in the foreground there, sort of the heart-shaped leaves, more than doubled after we focused our attention here. So it really is a testament to the fact that all of the residents of the redwood forest are very used to experiencing fire, and they're quite fire tolerant. So if you are interested in helping out with these work days and learning a little bit more about the dynamic between fire and redwood forests, you can check out the Cowell Redwoods State Park webpage. And we're currently discussing additional dates with the museum, so you can keep an eye on their webpage, and they'll have some dates listed in the future. So yeah, we hope to see you out there, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Question or two if anyone wants to follow up.
Yeah, on the.
Oh, thank you. I'm Larry Ford. I noticed, obviously, you're burning in piles, so you're not trying to distribute the burn effect across the whole forest floor. So what difference does that make? And I mean, other than for safety?
Yeah, so it's when we ignite brush piles, it's a very like targeted and localized effort, which is very, very controlled. Conversely, we could have broadcast burns, which is what you're talking about. Typically that happens in the sandhills ecosystem, and that has evolved with a low frequency but very high intensity fire. And so the return interval is like 80 to 120 years for something like that. But the way that is burned is more conducive for the fauna, that's found there. Whereas in the redwood forest, it's high frequency but low intensity burns. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the lack of impact on the forest floor. So you're not burning most of the duff and the organic material on top of the soil, and that might affect microorganisms.
Yeah, so the question was, how come, is there a reason why we're not burning the duff too? If you were to walk through the Redwood Grove at Cowell Redwoods State Park and sample like 5 different locations, you'd find that the duff is very, very, very thin, which online you would read that the duff can reach, up to like 5 feet in certain locations. But in this grove, it's very thin because despite California not having conditions to rot material, This grove is right next to the largest watershed in the mountains, the San Lorenzo River, and it's also at the base of Bear Mountain. And so this particular grove is in a situation where there's a good amount of moisture into the warm season. And so comparatively, there's kind of a higher amount of humidity in this particular grove. So if we compare this to other redwood groves, the rate of rot is faster here than many other locations because of where it's situated next to these water bodies.
Thank you.
My question was exactly discussed. And so, just like a follow-up on that, so it's partially because the conditions in this grove allow for this to be more effective, and so it takes less, it is less dangerous because it is more localized, and so since that will work in this habitat, then you go for it, or would you like to be able to do broadcast birds if it were possible?
My understanding is that it's not necessary because there's not a lot of duff, and when you think about the kind of material that would accelerate wildfires, it's going to be dry leaf litter and duff, and not like large woody debris. And so I think targeted pile burning is just the best methodology for this particular location.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I like really appreciate that Dylan is focusing on getting the community involved in this process too. It's pretty unique and special, and he does a really wonderful job of making these opportunities educational and community building. And so I really recommend that you reach out and try to be a part of it. And like you said, we'll try to have more walks. I'm going to have us move on to the next speaker, but again, there's going to be some more time for Q&A at the end. So our next speaker is going to be Ian Robotham from Sempervirens Fund. They are doing some amazing work at many properties that they manage, and also some properties that have burned, and also bringing fire back onto the landscape in these areas too. So I'm going to pull up the slideshow, and if you could also help me welcome Ian.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everyone. Yeah, so my name is Ian Robotham. I'm the Senior Stewardship Manager with Sempervirens Fund. We're California's oldest land trust. Since 1900s, we've been protecting the redwood forests and other habitats of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Today, I'm going to be talking about San Vicente redwoods in particular, and how we're working to manage landscape both for fire and with fire. So for those of you who haven't heard of San Vicente Redwoods, it's a 9,000 acre property, the largest privately owned property in the Santa Cruz Mountains, actually, located just north of here in Davenport, highlighted in yellow here just to get a sense of scale and regional context. It's a huge property. It's owned by a group of 4 nonprofit land trusts acquired in 2011. So it's co-owned between Sempervirens Fund as well as Peninsula Open Space Trust. Save the Redwoods League has a conservation easement that covers the entire property, essentially protecting it in perpetuity. And the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County is the public access manager for the property. San Vicente in many ways is really an experiment in and a testament to collaboration in that we tie in and actively manage the land for a whole suite of goals. Not only restoration, both restoration forestry, riparian restoration, endangered species restoration efforts, but also research, public access, as well as sustainable timber harvest. This map here shows kind of a breakdown of some of the management types across the property, but again, just to show a sense of the kind of scale and just, you know, the breadth of the type of work that we're trying to tackle out there. Since we're focusing on fire today, though, I wanted to start out by giving some context for the property and the fire history that really defines what we try to do there now, and also really with an eye towards the future. So this map shows the 2020 CZU burn scar here. You can see San Vicente Redwoods kind of down in the southwest, southeast portion there. So almost the entirety of the property burned in the fire. So at about 9,000 acres, it made up almost 10% of the overall fire scar, which is really significant. One point to note, and while this map might be a little hard for everyone to see up here, you can see San Vicente again, kind of that large green block in the southwestern edge there. The property also burned the 1948 Pine Mountain Fire and the 2009 Lockheed Fire. And those fires had very similar burn patterns to the 2020 CZU fire, both burning from the north, northwest down through the southeast with these really fierce winds, burning in pretty high intensity through them. So that's key for us in thinking about how we manage the property for fire and fuels, because this will really define what we're likely to see again in the future. This is a map showing the fire severity on San Vicente Redwoods. So you can see red is high severity, moving to the darkest greens being the lowest severities. We saw a pretty wide mix of burn severities on the property. Some areas, dense, really large redwood that burned at high severity that's sort of unprecedented. Other areas saw low severity burn in a way that was sort of just what was needed in many areas. But a lot of the high severity burn areas you'll see on here burned in that one single night where the fire really blew up and burned over 40,000 acres in a 12-hour period. So I'll get into some of the dynamics we're seeing in here too. So it's not the last to see of this map. One of the big things though with the high severity areas and just the scale, the kind of 1,000+ acres of high severity fire that we saw, is the conditions afterwards and how that's really impacted our management, both how we think about it long-term and short-term, and also just kind of an extra hurdle that it's added for us in being able to implement these projects. So on here, you can see the progression of a site. Upper left is pre-fire at this one site. Just below that is 8 months post-fire. So you can kind of see the complete canopy loss, high severity fire. There's just the slightest bit of green coming back up with those most kind of energetic species coming back up. The upper right, you can see 2 years post-fire. So just a huge abundance of the kind of quick succession species coming up, a lot of lupin in that picture, all sorts of other cool things. Bottom right shows 3 years. So between that 2 year to 3 year period, we've seen a huge amount of regrowth with a lot of those high severity and even the kind of moderate severity areas with these kind of almost 8-foot plus tall walls of vegetation of Ceanothus species, Yerba Santa, really interesting and kind of beautiful mix. Just all the kind of amazing colors coming back to the landscape. But at the same time, for fire and fuels management, not even just with those taller ones, but with some of the dead trees both standing and on the ground, it presents a huge obstacle for how do we tackle this? How are we able to bring fire back to the landscape and also protect the communities that really border this property? So the primary way that we've done that at San Vicente is utilizing shaded fuel breaks. That's in part because almost the entire property is forested, but essentially what a shaded fuel break is a way to maintain healthy canopy coverage. So, the larger trees, you maintain that kind of green canopy overhead while thinning the understory, removing ladder fuels. And you can kind of see the progression of that from left to right on the screen here of what it looks like. And I think some of Dylan's slides showed the before and after with some of the pile burning there. So the key with the shaded fuel breaks on a property of the scale that San Vicente is at 9,000 acres is those are really focused on key ridge lines. So I'll go and I'll show some slides of projects we're doing there, but the goal of the shaded fuel breaks and placing them on those ridge lines is for if fire comes through, say a larger wildfire comes through, the goal is to have those areas the fire can slow down. There's less fuel available for it when it hits that area that has a shaded fuel break, slow the fire, reduce the burn intensity, which has all sorts of beneficial impacts. And as Rick said earlier, is much more similar to the kind of fire that these landscapes have evolved with for the thousands of years that it's been managed. They also provide an opportunity for direct attack by firefighting agencies. So either to burn back at a fire, to do prescribed burns beforehand, or just to generally go after a fire. And they also, as I'll go into, help kind of box in areas or kind of surround areas that we might want to be able to do broadcast burning prescribed burning, cultural burning in the future. So one project to highlight that we're starting this year and will be continuing through the next couple years is along what's called Warrenella Road. This is kind of the main ridgeline road that runs top to bottom of the property. It goes from the top of Ben Lomond Mountain there along Empire Grade. You can see it up at the top, all the way down, single ridge line, eventually down through the Chitoni Coast Dairies National Monument out to the coast, and is a critical area, not only for CAL FIRE, but also for management of the property. So this project, huge scale funding from multiple agencies to tackle this, but it's about 9 miles long, over 500 acres. The goal is for a 400-foot wide tapered shaded fuel break. So again, like we saw in the picture, going from removing more fuels to kind of slowly fading out towards the further edges along the side of it. This fuel break is actually a really interesting one in that a decade ago, the Bonnie Doon Fire Safe Council, who have been just incredible partners for us out at San Vicente, installed a fuel break along the whole length of Warrenella. In 2009, the Lockheed fire was actually stopped along Warrenella Road by CAL FIRE, in part utilizing the shaded fuel break that was there, basically stopping the fire from proceeding towards Davenport and from Bonnie Doon nearby. And so the goal with this project is both to kind of recreate post CZU fire that shaded fuel break and also expand it. The next project that we have going on the next couple years is along what we're calling gates 4 through 6, but it's kind of 3 ridge lines running north to south, spurring off of Warrenella Road. Again, massive project, and similar goals: 200-foot wide shaded fuel break, and you can kind of see on the map on the right how these all line up. So when I'm talking about boxing in areas basically to try and burn, you can see along with Warrenella that some of these sub watersheds are kind of surrounded by these shaded fuel breaks that allow for us to try to burn larger swaths, bigger areas, to really kind of tackle the acreage that we need to, both to introduce fire as a key management tool with all the kind of ecological benefits that we've heard in the last 2 presentations, but also to help protect the communities where we've seen with low intensity burn, you're reducing fuels, you're reducing the risk of high severity burn in the future. The big question though for us, and what I was alluding to earlier with the post high severity burn conditions, is what do we do with all this material, in particularly the non-commercial, basically non-redwood material that's out there. For the most part, if it's not redwood in this region, there's not really anywhere for it to go. No one wants to buy old, rotted out Douglas fir, tan oak, madrone. Everyone has firewood post-fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So what do you do with that? If you can pay a lot to haul it off site, it's probably going to wind up at a dump somewhere that's not doing that much good. So one of the ways that we try to tackle that, again, just with the scale we're working with here, is using air curtain burners and the similar carbonator, air curtain burner on the left, carbonator on the right. These essentially are efficient ways to burn large volumes of material. It may not look great in these pictures, but they burn it efficiently with lower emissions and less particulates than open pile burning. That's just a matter of scale really for these versus in the Henry Cowell example. And while these have been fantastic for projects, they also present their own levels of hurdles and challenges with those, both permitting, cost of using these. There's also not that many units in our region. Hopefully that'll be ramping up. And also when you can use these in the burn season, you have to have people on site, water on site to put out any sparks that might come out of it. But I think the point of this also is that there's a lot of efforts to think of regional scale solutions for this. There are units of these that can plug into the grid, so you're actually producing electricity out of these. That would be great to see in the future. But the big thing is like we need to think big on this, because the issue with the fuels, both within the CZU burn scar and more broadly where we're managing these and either introducing fire or kind of mimicking it with mechanical means like this, that issue of what to do with the material is always going to be there. So All that said, so those shaded fuel breaks in a lot of ways are trying to set up the next step, which is reintroducing fire onto the landscape here. This is actually a picture from the same prescribed burn I think that Rick had some pictures of up before that we were able to partner with AMLT as well as CAL FIRE on, which was really cool. So for us, prescribed burning, we've been able to do a little bit of it. We have a VMP with CAL FIRE that covers about 80 acres. We're going for a VTP to cover the entire property. Those are basically permitting mechanisms. I'm sorry for the acronyms there. But since 2016, when we had that VMP, we've managed to burn about 25 acres at San Vicente. Again, 9,000 acre property, 26 acres. It's a start, but our goal is to really increase the pace and really the scale of that. So like I was talking about before, the kind of sub watershed scale once we have those shaded fuel breaks in place. So bigger and better to bring in really kind of the defining ecological and disturbance tool that we have on the landscape here. So I think maybe I'm kind of running over. I'll quickly go through this of just an example of some of the benefits and impacts of prescribed fire. So these pictures show an area along Empire Grade. South is at the top of the picture, north at the bottom, just to confuse everyone. But on the left is before the fire, just some arrows showing some defining features, Empire Grade, PG&E power line. And on the right is after the CZU fire. You can see the arrow pointing to a stretch of about 20 acres that CAL FIRE did a prescribed burn in February 2020, a few months before the CZU fire. So the fire came in this picture basically right to left through here. And you can see super high severity fire to the right by the power line, hits the prescribed burn area and burns at a pretty low intensity, kind of healthy fire that we would want to see, healthy canopy, all sorts of cool species coming up post-fire, fire following plants. This is a picture from the public access trail parking lot on the right. You can see high severity fire hits the prescribed burn area, and the line is just stark of what was burned and what was not burned with the burning beforehand. I think it's also important to note what these methods can and can't do necessarily and are or aren't supposed to do necessarily. Like from these examples, both with the shaded fuel breaks helping stop the Lockheed fire, this prescribed burn helping reduce the intensity in these areas, is that they provide opportunities as far as wildfires go to put out a fire, slow a fire, reduce the intensity, all those good things. They aren't necessarily going to stop a fire outright. So, you know, that's what we're trying to do. Big scale on these, build in all sorts of different tools to make things happen, but also recognizing that there's a lot of things that we have to do to really get out ahead of this. So thank you, everyone, for the time. Yeah, we're doing all sorts of cool work to help protect the communities, bring fire back. And again, a huge shout out to all the people we've collaborated with along the way. So thank you. You want me to call on people? Yeah. Okay. Right there. I saw you looking at first.
Meat burning machines that you have, some of the electricity, do they produce any other byproducts like ash or charcoal that are then usable as soil amendments or something?
Yeah, so the question was, do the air curtain burners or carbonators produce anything from their work? So the air curtain burners don't really, it's almost full consumption of it. The carbonators, on the other hand, about 10% of the biomass, it produces a biochar. So it kind of cycles out this biochar that a group that we work with, Ventana Forestry, then sells that or works with organic farms near Watsonville to use that as kind of a soil amendment, which is a really cool opportunity. So it's kind of a nascent market still for biochar. We're hoping to be able to build that out more, because that would be, again, producing something kind of like usable, valuable from the products as opposed to just purely burning them. So that's where, you know, for us, ideally, it would be we could do controlled burns to be able to put that back in the soil and kind of help that process. But if we can't do that, we have to use mechanical means, producing electricity, producing biochar. Those are huge. So just as an example, like the Warnella shaded fuel break, we're expecting that to produce about 10,000 tons of biomass from all the hazard trees that are in that kind of 500-acre swath and all the other fuels. So sense of scale. Yeah.
In the map, there was a rectangle that was not contiguous with the whole rest of the property. On the southeast side. And I'm just curious, doesn't that make it more difficult, or isn't that piece more vulnerable because you can't control what's around it?
The little like cookie cutout there on the left, is that the one you're talking about?
It's the other map.
Now it was to the east.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
that one. So
Little freckle on the Bonnie Ecological Reserve.
Oh, yeah, so that's part of the property, and that one was it did burn, although pretty low intensity in the fire, thankfully. It was a pretty healthy and had some redwood forest primarily. It does have some cool kind of almost sandhills, Santa Cruz cypress habitat on there. It is harder to manage, to your question, as far as, you know, these kind of large scale projects, because it is separated, but it was part of the property when we purchased it. The cool thing with this property is it's built into the Bonnie Doon Ecological Reserve trail system. So we do some management out there. But I think to your point, it is harder because it's separated. So
Is that Laguna Creek or is that separate?
Laguna Creek, yeah. So Laguna parcel. Angie, I saw your hand up. I didn't want to skip you. I'm sorry.
you mentioned, I think, that the law fire for the 2009 also went through that property.
Yes.
Did that area have a kind of a different burn regime because it had burned so recently, or?
It's a great question. So your question on the Lockheed fire burning through part of San Vicente and whether it had a different burn regime than the rest of the property. It burned hot in the Lockheed fire and it burned really hot in this fire too. My guess is that in the Pine Mountain fire it burned hot as well. I don't know. We don't have really great records from that, but in talking with some different experts, it seems like there's potential for high severity burns to kind of reproduce high severity burns in the future. The hope is that maybe we can kind of get out of that cycle so there isn't just full habitat type change. But the Lockheed section in particular, I mean, you can see it on the map there in the kind of lower left of the property there along that swath there, burned up the ridge line. So it burned really hot. Fire kind of accelerates up hills and burned hot as well. I mean, conditions post Lockheed fire were similar to what we're seeing now on the property that I was talking about, that 8-foot tall vegetation. In those areas that burned Lockheed, it was 15-20 feet tall. So it was ripe for another hot burn, basically. So
Same tree types?
redwood forest, a lot of ceanothus coming back up post Lockheed. So the ceanothus lives, I think, to around like 20-25 years, something like that, and tops out about that 20-foot tall, something like that. And so a lot of those areas were super thick with ceanothus, but the ceanothus was kind of dying off. So successionally, you know, that's where it would start to get topped out again, potentially by other species. But with fire coming through, that's where there's the potential for that cycle recycling.
All right, and I'll pause us here. But again, we'll have more time for questions later. Thank you, Ian. So we've been hearing about some larger properties in our region, state parks, this other large piece at San Vicente Redwoods, which is managed not only by Sempervirens Fund, but Post and the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County and Save the Redwood League. And so we're thinking about our landscape, which does have a lot of acreage to consider and a lot of wild space. And also we live in and around these places, which was kind of evident in some of the maps too. So I appreciate hearing about the projects that are happening at these large land management levels from Dylan and Ian. And then next I'm going to bring up Laurel Bard, who works for the Resource Conservation District as the Forest Health and Wildfire Resilience Project Assistant. Is that the full title? Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. And so Laurel's going to be sharing a slightly different perspective. The RCD also does work on like large scale things too, and has partnered with some of the agencies that we've been talking about, but also is like a really wonderful resource for our residents. So please help me in welcoming Laurel. Okay, here we go, Laurel. Okay.
Thanks, Marisa. I'm Laurel Bard. I work with the Resource Conservation District, and I just had a great time standing up. So if anyone wants to stand up while I explain what the RCD is, you please feel free. So the Resource Conservation District, or RCD, is a public agency in a special district. We are non-regulatory, so that means we don't go out on people's properties to enforce laws or get people in trouble. Instead, we provide technical assistance, and that ethos of assistance came out of the Great Depression when RCDs were formed to help farmers basically conserve their soil in a really difficult time for agriculture. So we come out of helping people help the land, and that's our mission and ethos. So in that same vein, today I'm going to be presenting about how we as individuals and as a community can help protect both our individual homes and also our shared home, which is the landscape and ecology that we live on, and how each of these individual and community efforts can add up to something similar to the landscape scale management efforts that you heard about at San Vicente Redwoods and with state parks. So first, I just want to say that humans are ecosystem engineers, as we've been hearing and learning. So ecosystem engineers are animals that, like beavers, through the actions of their day-to-day lives, produce large-scale ecosystem changes. So just like beavers knock down trees and build dams that block rivers and create wetlands, so too do humans create large-scale ecosystem effects when we build our homes and when we live our lives. And as we heard from Rick Flores and from others, humans have been involved in the ecosystem development of California for thousands of years. And using prescribed fire is one of the many ways that people have been involved in building healthy ecosystems in California for a really long time. So your home, your yard, and our community are all a part of a dynamic ecosystem that we are building, shaping, and affecting every day. You are a member of the ecosystem. I'm a member of the ecosystem, and our actions reflect that. And humans can influence fire behavior by maintaining healthy ecosystems. And the way you can do this is you can start with your own home on a really small scale. So a lot of what our work is when we work with communities who live in the Wildland-Urban Interface is we talk about building defensible space around your home in the event of a wildfire. So the most small scale thing that you can do is work on home hardening. So that means building your home in a flame resistant way, using flame resistant building materials, cleaning your gutters regularly, and covering your vents with fine mesh to reduce entry points for embers in the event of a fire. One step removed from that is defensible space. So this is the area around your home that really starts to become a part of that shared ecosystem. And so we can look at this as a series of zones that start from 5 feet around your home to 5 to 30 feet around your home to 30 to 100 feet around your home and then beyond. So in the 0 to 5 foot area, you have the ember resistant zone, which is hardscaped with non-flammable material, ideally. And again, this is mostly relevant for people who live in the Wildland-Urban Interface, but this can also give you an idea if you want to have a native plant garden or if you want to sort of rewild your landscape in town, this can give you some ideas on how to do that. So in the 0 to 5 foot zone, you're going to want gravel or a sort of concrete path, something that's hardscaped. So if an ember were to land right next to your house, it wouldn't immediately catch fire and start burning your siding. You can have sparse, low-growing green and live plants in this area, and we would encourage you to have that, but you definitely don't want to have any dry or flammable material, and ideally you don't want things that are leaving woody vines on your house. In the 5 to 30 foot zone, that's a little bit farther out, you're definitely going to want to have live and healthy plants in this area. You're going to want islands of native vegetation that are separated by paths of dirt, mulch, and gravel. So you can think of like a community garden or a landscaped park where you're walking around islands of vegetation. You're also going to want to remove the lower branches of trees and shrubs so that they're separated from any continuous fuels you might have on the ground. And you want to maintain your plants by continuously removing dead and dry material. And in the final zone of your defensible space, that's the 30 to 100 foot zone, this is also known as the reduced and managed fuel zone. And again, you're going to want to reduce ladder fuels and connectivity. So what that means is if you have any large trees or if you have a connected tree canopy in this area, you're going to want to make sure to take out any dead vegetation, especially sort of suppressed understory trees that might be able to carry fire from the ground, which ideally has ground cover, up to the tops of the trees. You do want to keep dead and down material to a minimum, but isolated pockets of large woody debris can be fine, because that's an important part of ecosystem succession and development, is to have decomposing material, sort of as Dylan mentioned. And especially in this area, of course, in the close areas, but here especially, you're going to want to remove invasive plants and prioritize native plants. So here's an example of what defensible space maintenance can look like. And it honestly looks a lot like what you see state parks doing in the Redwood Grove area. So you can see that here in the upper Redwood Grove, people removed this, it looks like a downed bay that was leaning on a stump here. So that's a good example of a ladder fuel. Thank you. And here on the side, you can see it's cleared out and a lot more open. And you can see the same thing in the lower example. And in the lower example, I think it's great because you can see that there's wood chips and duff that are still left on the ground. And it's really important to maintain that ground cover, so you're retaining moisture in the soil and maintaining soil health. So just to really drive it home, defensible space maintenance and landscaping in this way is a form of ecosystem engineering. So the picture I have here is an example from Southern California. This is the home of Cassie Iowagi, who's the president of Form Landscaping. And this example was from a CalFlora article. They're a really good resource, CalFlora, when it comes to native plants that you can put in your landscaping, plant around your home, and it also tells you how to take care of them. And you can see here that there are separated islands of larger plants, and there's a lower lying level of ground cover that's well irrigated and not very flammable that connects these islands of native vegetation. A couple lessons for defensible space as ecosystem engineering is that you really do want to keep it green. So don't clear down to bare soil, and lightly but consistently irrigate the landscape around your home. And the RCD has some materials, not here with us today, but if you go on our website, about using rainwater catchment and rain dispersal as a form of irrigation that helps conserve water. So defensible space is also a form of ecosystem engineering, in that what you're doing is you're assisting succession. So wildfire and prescribed fire have historically been sources of essentially tree mortality. So they help select for trees and plants with certain traits. When you exclude wildfire from the ecosystem, as you might want to do around your house, you have a situation where the trees and shrubs that might otherwise be taken out by a wildfire are actually still growing. So as an ecosystem engineer, you can do the selection for the fire that isn't happening. So you can select the healthiest trees and shrubs for retention around your house. So you can act as that ecosystem force in the place of wildfire. And again, let large logs decompose in the 30 to 100 foot zone, because this is going to help all of those great decomposer parts of the ecosystem have a place to flourish near your house. And to that end, defensible space can also create and maintain habitat. So native plants are pollinator habitat, sometimes for really specific pollinator species that might only be associated with one type of flower or one type of bush. And having these native plants in your home turns your yard into a really important pollinator ecosystem. And these plants can remain fire resistant when irrigated and pruned properly. So when you're removing dead material from them. And again, be a good neighbor to everyone who lives here. So avoid disturbing birds' nests and other animal nests if possible while you're doing landscaping and defensible space clearing. For birds especially, the key time for their nesting is May to August. So we recommend, if possible, you avoid clearing during that time. And as others have talked about, there are examples of larger landscape scale management going on outside of people's defensible space areas. And we do need to think beyond property boundaries and just beyond our own individual homes, because obviously ecosystems aren't bound by property lines. So groups like Firewise Communities, the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, the CCPBA, who's going to give a presentation here in a second, and the Resource Conservation District, among others, have done projects where we've brought together a bunch of different private landowners and done projects that cross the boundaries of their properties. So we can address a landscape scale issue while still working with a bunch of different private landowners. And again, our efforts are not preventing wildfire or modifying fire behavior. So when a wildfire approaches the projects that we've done, we hope that fire behavior will be more moderate to pretty low intensity, and that makes it easier for CAL FIRE to deal with. And it also means that it's going to produce a different range of ecosystem effects than a high severity fire. We might see more regeneration of certain plants. Some examples of RCD projects where we've worked with a lot of different landowners are the Summit Road Shaded Fuel Break. I don't know if any of you live on Summit or drive Summit regularly, but that was an effort all along Summit, about 80 acres, involving over 100 landowners. That was brought to us by a community group who said, hey, we're really concerned about the safety of our evacuation route. So we said, okay, we can be the nexus. Will you guys do your community outreach efforts, and then we'll help contact all of the landowners and then do a joint project that goes across all of their properties. Similarly, the Grand Hill Shaded Fuel Break was a partnership between the RCD state parks and private land. And here we were doing also a shaded fuel break in a different habitat. This was partially sandhills, which is an important ecosystem that has some different needs than the mixed redwood forest that's along Summit. We're also helping state parks do some burn prep at Nicene Marks, where they're hoping to burn more at a watershed scale. And there are more. If you want to go to our website, you can find them. So to bring it all back, how do we tie together this defensible space and the landscape scale management? How do you as an individual come to understand yourself as a member of this ecosystem community and as an ecosystem engineer? Well, I think that what's really important to do here is to connect with the landscape so that we can learn how to protect it. So the first step here is really establishing that connection. And a lot of people here are probably on their way, and I think the Natural History Museum is a really good resource for this. But the first steps are to just learn the name of the ecosystem that you live in. And if you live in town, you can do some research to learn about the ecosystem type that existed before the town of Santa Cruz was developed in the area where you live. And learn to recognize at least one native plant that you see frequently in your everyday life. So here I have some examples of naturally occurring ecosystems in the Santa Cruz County. We have oak woodland, redwood forest that everyone is very familiar with. And we also have the Santa Cruz Sandhills, which I've mentioned a couple times. And the Sandhills is actually an ecosystem that only occurs in Santa Cruz County. If you ever get the chance, Henry Cowell has a great example of some Sandhills habitat, and that's a shrubland. But when you are thinking about the ecosystem that you live in, you can think about some guiding questions that can help you really connect with it. So when you're thinking about certain plants and when you've maybe learned the name of one or two plants, you can think, okay, how do these plants affect the ecosystem that they're growing in? Do they provide shade? Do they make leaf litter? Do they attract pollinators? And you can learn all of these things by just going out and observing this stuff on your land or on a state park. And also you can think more personally about how certain plants affect you. How do they make you feel? Can you eat parts of them? And this is, don't go eating random plants. This is once you learn how to identify them and find reputable resources, can you use parts of them for art and just be considerate and don't eat or use endangered plants, obviously. But these are just ways to help you think about yourself as a part of this ecosystem that we all live in, because we are part of it. And once you gain that sense of connection, then you can really learn in an educated and holistic way how to protect the environment that you live in. So you can learn to recognize the signs of a healthy ecosystem and signs of potential ecosystem distress. Ecosystem stressors can increase vulnerability to wildfire and to other things, so it's important that we recognize them. So some symptoms of ecosystem distress can be mass die-off, invasive species encroachment, all trees and shrubs of the same age, and a lot of these are actually the result of a disrupted fire regime that's doing that succession and that selection that I talked about earlier. And a healthy ecosystem is one in which the fire return interval reflects historic patterns and current conditions. One that recovers after fire, so one where you see regeneration, one where you can see how the ecosystem will reestablish itself after that disturbance, one that has ecosystem appropriate plants and animal species. And again, this, you need to learn about the ecosystem specifically that you live in to be able to recognize this, and one where the age structure is varied. And the RCD can actually help with this learning process for a lot of residents. We can do technical assistance visits to your property where we can give you information about the land that you live on. We can also do forest management planning, which is a bit more of a formalized process for that. We have a lot of web and print resources, and we have a lot of interagency collaboration. So if we don't have the answer, we can direct you to someone who does. Like, for example, Firewise Leaders. We also have a defensible space assistance program to go back to that example of ecosystem engineering, where we can help you with your defensible space. All right, participating in your local ecosystem is key to protecting your home from wildfire. I hope that's the takeaway you get from this presentation. And if anyone has any questions, feel free. Yes.
I think something that maybe the RCD put together as well was some of the worst weeds of Santa Cruz County. I mean, a lot of those are highly flammable as well. So I think there tend to be a lot of people that aren't aware of those. So it's important to know what is your worst invasive around your property too.
Yeah, that was a community member just brought up that invasive and introduced weeds can be a lot more flammable and a lot less resilient to wildfire than a lot of our native plants. So it's important to be able to recognize if you have any of those invasive species on your property and to know how to get rid of them, because they're very stubborn when it comes to removal. The RCD does have resources on our website about weeds and weed management. So if you want to look into that, you can visit our website. Anyone else? Yes.
I've heard so many conflicting stories about ceanothus and how flammable it is and how close to let it grow your house. What do you?
I think that ceanothus can be a problem when it's an undifferentiated bed of ceanothus, and when you do have a lot of sort of dead material in there. So the pictures at San Vicente, you could see how it was growing just as a sort of continuous vegetation bed that went up to 10 feet tall. So that structure, if it's not irrigated or if it's a drought year and it does get really dry and have dead parts, the vegetation structure in an example like that could lead to increased flammability. But if you're maintaining a few islands of ceanothus on your property, and this would probably be in the 30 to 100 foot zone in your defensible space, and you are doing some low intensity but regular irrigation and pruning out dead material, I would say that those islands of ceanothus on your property don't represent a very strong fire threat, and also they can be really great pollinator habitat. All right, passing on to Jared.
All right, thank you, Laurel, and thank you to the RCD. Yeah, so many thoughts about that. And on the note of ceanothus too, we've been doing our walks up at the Upper Fall Creek unit of Henry Cowell, and there have been some really amazing stories of ceanothus there where, like Dylan, who spent so much time up there, had never seen ceanothus there before. And then after the fires, they're growing really beautifully, and also makes me just think about succession and the fire return interval, and how at San Vicente, maybe it was too soon for that fire to come back in, and the ceanothus hadn't actually had a chance to get shaded out yet. So, and we also have a program on our website that I will include a link to in a follow-up email, including links to resources from the RCD. You'll get an email with lots of links. Where Rob Cuthrell, who works with the Amah Mutsun Land Trust, talked about the frequency of finding ceanothus in archaeological remains at Curastay Valley, and how it was a really important fire starter tool for Indigenous communities. So ceanothus, very interesting. Okay, so we are gonna now bring in our final presentation of the night. Jared Childress is the coordinator for our local Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association, and is also a wildland firefighter and does many great things. So he's going to be talking about the work that the CCPBA does, and how you might be able to get involved. And then after Jared talks, we'll just bring, before we go into Q&A with Jared, we'll just bring everyone up, and then we'll go into big Q&A time. So please help me in welcoming Jared. Oh, sorry. And then I had another job to do. Sorry, one second.
And also it's a long presentation, so it's gonna scroll down.
All right, here we go. Or do you want to just see the long presentation that Jared has?
Okay, go up.
Okay.
Right to that one. Right there.
All right, there we go.
So up. Oh yeah, that one, and then current slide. Right there.
We should just have you do it. Okay, there we go.
Okay. All right, good evening, everyone. So no standing, by the way. No, kidding. I'm the program manager for the Central Coast Prescribed Burn Association. You probably most likely haven't heard of a Prescribed Burn Association before. There's a long and interesting history that I usually talk about, but I'll just briefly say that Prescribed Burn Associations actually started in California in the 1940s and 50s, but they were called range improvement associations. And it was ranchers helping ranchers burn, usually because of brush encroachment into the rangelands. And it was such a good idea that it got exported to the Midwest, where it became very popular in Oklahoma, Texas, the Southeast. And today there's numerous prescribed burn associations in those areas. They slowly died out in California, unfortunately. And there's only 2 active ones, and they're barely active, Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo. And then they boomeranged in 2017 to California with some colleagues of mine, Lenya Quinn Davison and Jeffrey Stackhouse, got inspired by the burning they were seeing happen in the Midwest and decided we should get this going. Well, if anyone remembers what was going on in 2017, we had the wine country fires in the North Bay, followed by 2018, the Paradise Camp Fire, followed by 2020, no big secret in Santa Cruz what happened in 2020. I forgot 2019, we had the Kincaid Fire, which was a big deal in Sonoma County as well. 2021 kind of blew the doors off, whatever doors were still left to be blown off. And so the PBAs have really grown throughout California and become very exciting to efforts for community burning. So the Central Coast PBA is Santa Cruz County, San Benito, and Monterey counties. It's one of the bigger ones in California right now. And it was started via a grant from CAL FIRE by a colleague of mine, Davey Rao, colleague of yours as well, Larry, and the Monterey RCD as well. So right now, currently, that's its structure. It's a project of the UC Cooperative Extension and the Monterey RCD. And what we do is we build a capacity for good fire, because right now we do not have it. Even the fire agencies themselves do not have it. There are individuals, of course, within certain fire agencies who are really good at lighting prescribed burns. But mostly what fire agencies are good at is attacking fire and putting it out. And these two things are parallel, but not the same. So here's an example of the Range Improvement Association that used to exist in San Benito County that is no longer there, but we're actually working with the same landowner's daughter. So this is the historic landowner burning on his land with the Range Improvement Association. And so we're working with his daughter, Kathy Spencer, and we just finished a burn plan on the same ranch, and we'll hopefully be doing a burn there this fall. And it will be about 25 years since that land has seen fire. So who is part of a prescribed burn association? Well, everyone in this crowd, if you want to be, everyone at home listening, if you want to be. It is community driven. It is mostly volunteers with a couple paid people who mostly, in my case, do volunteer management. I'm also a burn boss, but the majority of my work is actually managing our volunteers, teaching workshops, doing trainings. For instance, tomorrow I'm teaching a S219 firing operations class for about 30 people who are coming from all over the region for it. And then on Sunday, this upcoming Sunday, hopefully if the weather cooperates, we'll be doing a burn at the end of our training with those individuals. That'll be in San Benito County. But who participates is land trusts, tribes, universities. We get a lot of researchers who are interested. So on Sunday, for instance, we're going to have a handful of researchers out working on their projects. Fire departments, we have Central Fire as an example joining us this weekend, coming and training with us, and I'm going to be on the burn. Hollister Fire will be there as well, hopefully. And we have ranchers, of course, and then we have what I call the fire curious. And the fire curious is anyone who's interested in fire. And it seems to be a high percentage of mechanical engineers. I don't know why. They're really handy. And I think what they see is they see a problem and they want to figure it out, right? They see a problem in California with these mega fires that we're having, and they're going, okay, how can I be a part of this solution? So this photo is a funny one. This is actually from Sonoma, where I started an earlier PBA, the Good Fire Alliance. And I like to have it up there because no one likes to dig, yet we can get volunteers to come out and dig. So with the building capacity component, or building a culture of good fire, the things that we do a training that I call the fire lighter training. Sometimes it's a 2-day training, sometimes it's a 1-day training, but essentially it's a basic wildland firefighter 1-day training where people do online coursework beforehand. They come to the training, and if they've done a particular physical exercise called a pack test, we can actually give them the stamp of approval. They're now actually qualified at the federal level to be a wildland firefighter. So they could go out and say, get a job with national parks, with the Forest Service, BLM, any of these kind of federal agencies. Also state parks recognizes it as well. But we also allow people just to come to the training for the day, skip the online portion, and just get that hands-on experience, and they can come to burns. So really the entry point is quite low. Just a day of training, and then the burn itself is the training. We do training burns, of course. We have equipment for all of this. We have PPE. We've organized tours that I've been calling fire follower tours, where we go to prescribe burns that we've done or others have done, and then wildfire, and we look at the differences and we talk about what we're seeing. Pile burn workshops, we do quite a few of those. Treks, which I'll talk about here in a minute. Also, we have funding to help large landowners, usually ranches and such, private landowners, acquire burn plans, because that's the first step in doing burning on their land. We connect people with burn bosses, and then we have a tribal apprenticeship with the Amah Mutsun Land Trust and also the Esalen tribe of Monterey County. And that's basically funding for those tribal members who are part of the apprenticeship to attend burns, to come to trainings, go to other people's trainings, go to other tribes' burns to be learning from them, and to build that capacity and build that culture. And one thing I actually will say, and this is a big portion of presentations that I do when I have time, is there's a lot of discussion about fire suppression being the problem. You hear that over and over again. Fire suppression is the problem. Fire suppression is the problem. That's a piece of the puzzle for sure, especially in national forest areas, especially in areas that get a lot of lightning fire, right? So up in the Sierras, the Klamath region, where you have a lot of fire that's going to happen whether humans are present or not, right? That fire suppression is putting out those fires. Well, on the coast, despite 2020, we don't get much lightning fire. It's very rare. The fire return interval for this area, this is really hard to figure out, but based on pollen records and some sediment layers, for this area, previous 15,000 years seems to be about every 100 years. Well, 15,000 years, there starts to be a lot of burning, and you see that fire return interval enter into the 40, then into the 20, then into the every 3-year kind of returns that Rick was talking about. And that's indigenous burning. And so the original fire suppression that has really affected coastal California is colonization. And I would say, if you're going to take away one thing from my talk, that's the one. Just this spring, we put on a very exciting event. It's called the Central Coast Cal Treks. Treks stands for not decking, but it stands for training exchange. And it's a program that has happened all over the country, started by the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service, but then moved into international scale now. Now they're in Portugal and South Africa and other places. And we had 70 participants burning in Monterey and San Benito counties, We didn't actually burn in Santa Cruz County, but we did a really great fire ecology tour with Tim Highland from Santa Cruz State Parks District. We focused on training for 7 days while burning. And we had international participants from Honduras, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Spain. We had tribal members from Oregon, from the Auburn Rancheria in the foothills of California. And then we had, of course, our own tribal representatives participating. And then we had firefighters joining us. We had land managers. We had RCD staff who just spoke before me participating in it. We had all sorts of people training for a week straight and working together and presenting to each other rather than just learning from one person or 10 people. The 70 people were training each other, and everyone had something to offer. It was really great. So we'll hopefully be doing more of those in the future. So be on the lookout for the training exchanges. And then we've been doing training burns. So this was our first training burn at Watsonville Slough on Santa Cruz Land Trust land, where we taught the participants appropriate firing techniques, taught them how to do suppression techniques, and kind of showed them the whole ins and outs. Some more images from it. That dog was not actually there, but the fire behind it was. And then this is some of the research that we've been doing. We helped spearhead with San Jose State a research project at the Santa Lucia Conservancy in Carmel Valley, looking at coyote brush encroachment into coastal prairie. And can we augment the fuels beforehand to get it to burn in a way that we're going to get higher mortality with the coyote brush? Because while coyote brush is native and is definitely an important species in California, it's highly disruptive to coastal prairie, and we're losing a lot of coastal prairie, which is a very diverse ecotype in the coastal area. And so we wanted to see, can we get a better burn window by augmenting these fuels and then comparing those various augmentations? So we did chainsaw cutting beforehand, we did mastication or mowing in some plots, and then we did crushing, and then of course a control. And so this is a project that's still underway. And then something I'm really excited about, because I think this is starting to get into the new territory and breaking some of the boundaries that exist out there, which is why can't volunteers help with broadcast burns in state parks? And the reality is, at least in the Santa Cruz district, is volunteers can't. Basically, they have to have their basic wildland firefighter training. They have to have appropriate personal protective equipment that the PBA can provide, both of those things. And say in the fall, like last fall at Wilder State Park, with our volunteers in State Park, we participated in about 1,000 acres of grassland burns and about 250 acres of woodland burns. And then this spring, we participated in the sandhill burning at Henry Cowell, and then some pile burning at Big Basin. And so hopefully year in, year out, it will start to grow. And what I'm hoping is that this will actually start to spread to other park districts, like Monterey Park District, if they're listening, and the Diablo District in San Benito County, and then also hopefully with other PBAs and other park districts. Because if you have trained volunteers with equipment, we can double the acreage that's done sometimes, or at least double the numbers of people that are on a burn. And it can be pretty mellow, which you can see in the upper right photo. That's him eating lunch, by the way. This is actually a husband and wife combo, the woman by the big redwood tree, and then the man eating his lunch. It's Dennis and Jane. They actually live up on Summit. And that's Nico down with the Amah Mutsun. So if you're interested in being involved, you can email me and we'll put you on our low flow announcement list. That's how you'll hear about trainings and events. Or you can go to cowellpba.org, and that's become kind of a statewide website to learn everything there is to know about PBAs in California. And that's all.
So yeah, so we will go back into question time. That was all the presentations that we have. So I'm gonna invite all of the speakers to come up here. And maybe I'll turn the lights on too, and then we can just keep talking, and whoever wants to take a question can come up here and take it. So any questions?
Slide that was right before this one with the burn on around Redwood. When others have talked about their burning kind of programs and what was happening, it's like sort of underbrush and, you know, building brush piles. What is the thinking around the tree circle?
Yeah, so the question was, what is the goal or the thinking around the burning around the what is, you know, maybe an old growth redwood tree. So that's in Wilder State Park. That was last fall. That method of putting the fire right around the base of the tree is actually called ring firing, and it's a particular technique. And the idea is that instead of having fire rush up the canyon and run into the tree with a lot of heat and intensity, you're actually starting the fire right at the base of the tree so that it slowly burns away from the tree. And so you're actually putting less heat onto the tree. And so we do it with particular heritage trees as a way to put less heat on them because they're special trees. There's only a few old big trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So that's the technique there. The rest of the canyon, which didn't have heritage trees, we were putting fire wherever we could. And so you're getting a real diversity. You're getting head fire, as we call it, which goes uphill and with the wind. We have backing fire that's very slow that goes downhill. And then we have what's called flanking fire, which is kind of a sideways in between of those two. And so you're getting a pyro diversity of firing techniques. But with that particular tree, that's why we did that.
I'm wondering about when you are designing a prescribed burn. There's so many things that seem to be that you could take into account. I live off of Smith Grade near where the CZU came down, and there's endangered cypress. And so I was taking a walk the other day, and there's an area where they've been studying. They come out every year or so and study this area to look at the cypress trees and other plants. And they were counting cypress trees, and there's a lot of dead snags and, you know, a lot of brush. And I said, would this be a great place to do a prescribed burn? I mean, I'm thinking that every day when I walk up there. And she said, well, no, this would just wipe out the cypress trees because they're just little now. The big ones burned and they're just little and they wouldn't have a chance to reproduce. And that was something I never thought of. So I'm wondering, there must be many other species like that.
Yeah, so the question is prescribed fire or any fire really as it relates to Santa Cruz cypress, to paraphrase. And I'm definitely not an expert on Santa Cruz cypress, but what I've gleaned is that there is a period of time when they're young that they're very susceptible to fire. And there's a fair number of trees that fit this category. Knobcone pine would be another example, where knobcone pine is very fire adapted. It actually, I don't know if need is the right word, but it really likes fire once it's made cones. But it doesn't really make cones till it's about 12 years old in that neighborhood, 8 to 15, I think, something like that. So if you have a bunch of young, say 5-year-old knobcone pines and you have another fire come through, they haven't actually made seed yet. And so the Santa Cruz cypress is a similar element. But once the trees are old enough and they've made seed, then they're actually what's called serotinous, where they like fire because it helps open their cones, and then it creates bare soil for the new seedlings. So again, it gets into that fire return interval that others had mentioned. Fire return intervals become really important. So for instance, with the sandhill areas over at Henry Cowell, Dylan was pointing out that the fire return interval is quite long, 80 to 100 plus years, right? And that's because those particular species, especially certain manzanita, are obligate seeders, meaning that they need a long time to mature to create the seed before they burn again. If you burn too soon, you'll actually lose those species. If that is a good answer. We're almost neighbors, by the way. I live in Bonnie Doon as well.
Follow up to kind of what you were asking about this bird around the tree. Can you do that with all species? I remember after the fire, we were talking about certain species that if their cambium layer gets burned, that will actually the other species can resprout, or redwoods are resilient to fire and oaks. So I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah. So what I love about prescribed fire is the complexity. From an ecological standpoint in coastal California, it's about as complex as it gets. And then you have the human element, which is really fascinating too. And maybe being generous by calling it fascinating at times. But no, it really is actually fascinating. And so, for instance, with the ponderosa pines that you see at Henry Cowell, my understanding is, and again, I've only burnt there once, but maybe Dylan, if you want to take a crack at this one, but what they're finding is that while ponderosa pine are very fire tolerant throughout the West, the ones in Henry Cowell seem to not be able to handle much fire within the drip line of the trees. And so the original burns that were being done at Henry Cowell, they were seeing a lot of mortality with the ponderosa pine. And these are big, large, established trees, right? 100 plus years or something. So at this point, what they're trying to do is essentially keep the fire out of the drip line of those trees, because right now it's still not even totally understood why they're not handling that fire, even though it's maybe a low intensity fire. A drip line is, so like everyone's experienced it. It's where when say fog or rain is hitting the branches of the tree, where how far out the drip will go. Especially on the coast, fog would be a big example of that.
Dylan, do you have anything to add about what Jared was saying about Henry Cowell?
I would be speculating, so no.
I mean, maybe it's a question for you, Jared, but I know one thing that is definitely of interest for us, in areas at San Vicente and other properties where there's historic oak woodland or hardwood forest, where due to a lack of fire for such a long period of time, there's been a lot of encroachment by Douglas fir and other species that have grown up to top out, basically grow over the top of these large oak species, shade them out, they start to die off with a lack of sunlight. And whether there's a way through prescribed burning to, because Douglas fir is more susceptible to fire than many of the oak species, whether there's a way to specifically get hot fire at some of those species. Again, very small acreage prescribed burning we've done at San Vicente, we saw very little mortality of Doug fir in what was largely kind of area with large heritage oaks and oak and hardwood.
Sure.
Sorry, cut mine.
Yeah, so Douglas fir encroachment is also a big problem in coastal California. It's a factor here in Santa Cruz County. It's a huge factor north of San Francisco, where you're seeing your Oregon oaks and such, like say in Sonoma County, Mendocino County, your valley oaks being overtopped by the Doug firs. It's called piercing. Historically, low intensity fire in those oak woodlands, mostly by indigenous burning, would have kept those Doug firs in check. And where I grew up in the East Bay Hills, we're seeing it with bay laurel. So the bay laurel is doing the exact same thing with our live oaks. And again, bay laurel is very susceptible to fire, especially when young. Doug firs are very susceptible to fire when young, but once they're established and usually over the canopy, it's really hard to burn in a way that will actually cause mortality of those Douglas fir trees. And so that's where you see the mechanical element come in, and that's where, you know, chainsaws become useful and such. But there are examples, again, I used to live and work in Sonoma County, which has seen more than its fair share of wildfire. And there's definitely forests there, like if you know Annandale State Park, where hot fire has come through, canopy fire, caused large-scale Doug fir mortality, but the oaks are durable enough that they do what's called epicormic sprouting, which is where they sprout off of the trunks of the trees. And so you've kind of got this reset back to an oak forest. And so in those areas, I would make it a priority to reburn with low intensity fire to keep the baby Doug firs from encroaching. Yeah, I mean, a friend and colleague of both of ours referred to the upper part of San Vicente Redwoods as a lovely oak forest with a Doug fir problem.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this whole program. I've learned a lot and I'm really well educated. And I still learn a lot. And so I really appreciate that. And my first question is, what can we do to really expedite and, you know, scale up all these different programs that you're talking about? I come from a background where I experienced the CZU fire, and luckily didn't lose my home, but it really scared me. And so did the Oakland fire when I was in school at Berkeley. That was super frightening. And then the Paradise Fire, I think, was the worst example that I've heard about, where all these old hippies like me were living, they didn't know how to take care of themselves, they didn't have chainsaws in the back of their pickup trucks, things like that. And so a lot of them died. And a lot of them lost their homes. So how can we expedite this expansion of these programs? It seems to me what we really need to do is have a whole landscape kind of focus. And we, of course, need a lot of money. And then we need to replicate each of you by 10 and 20. But I think one of the biggest problems that we have is we don't know what the landscape really looked like, you know, 1,000 years ago. And I'd like to know from whoever can tell me, you know, how did the indigenous people really manage the whole landscape? Not just the oak woodlands, not just the red woodlands, not just the grasslands, which at that time was entirely different because it hadn't been invaded by all these Mediterranean grasses. But anyway, how did they do that? Do we know what? I mean, do we have a model of that? I mean, there's a little bit of work, Cat Anderson and people like that, but doesn't describe that. You know what all the different vegetation types, say in the Santa Cruz Mountains, really would have looked like 1,000 years ago.
I'm going to paraphrase the question, which is, what is to be done? It was a very detailed question about kind of ways to move forward, but also what was historically present. Anyone?
I'll take my best stab at that question. The short answer is, you know, no, we don't know what the landscape looked like 1,000 years ago, but we do know indigenous people were burning the landscape 1,000 years ago. One of the most interesting research projects and pretty groundbreaking research projects that the Amah Mutsun have taken part of is at Coroste Valley Cultural Preserve. And it's a fairly new area of research. They call it paleoethnobotany or archaeobotany. And what they did with archaeologists from UC Berkeley was they used ground penetrating radar to find old fire pits. And they unearthed those fire pits and separated out small microscopic seed fragments from the soil to determine what native people were burning and cooking in those fire pits. And what they discovered is that native people were burning and cooking a lot of grassland seafoods. The Poaceae family, which is the grass family, showed up in large extent. Hazelnuts were the largest kind of nut that was found. A lot of times we hear a lot about acorns, but in this one particular site, we know hazelnuts were a really important nut harvest. And the Asteraceae family, a lot of times they couldn't go down to like genus, but they can identify the plant to families and stuff. And the Asteraceae family showed up, which is the sunflower family. And so this research could actually, only go back about 500 years, but we suspect that it can go back even farther than that. And so with that archaeological knowledge, the tribe now knows what plants belong in Coroste Valley in that ecosystem. A lot of those plants are not there anymore. Some of them are, but they can use that archaeological research to identify what should be there or what was there historically. So that's one way that researchers are beginning to understand what the landscape looked like, pre-contact. But to go back 1,000 years, we can't say exactly what it looked like, but we know that there were coastal prairies here because native people were eating a lot of grassland seed foods. We know that there were huge hazelnut stands because they show up in great extent in archaeological sites. We know that oak woodlands were really important because acorns was one of the staples of all indigenous diets in California where oaks occurred. And we've heard from many people that without stewardship, without disturbance regimes such as fire, plant succession happens. We've heard that coyote brush invades rangelands or grasslands. And so, range managers want to burn to keep coyote brush at bay. Douglas fir trees are fire susceptible. So native people burned oak woodlands. So those Douglas fir trees would not invade oak woodlands and would keep the acorn harvest and things like that. So there's certain things that we can infer through ethnographies and current scientific research in the archaeological fields and anthropology fields. But I don't know that we can specifically say that what exactly a landscape looked like 1,000 years ago. And another point to make is that just because a plant does not occur here now does not mean it was not here historically. A good example of that is we know that deergrass, Muhlenbergian rigans, was an extremely important grass to make watertight cooking baskets. And it was a skill that was used by a lot of California Indian tribes. But we don't see a lot of deergrass here in Santa Cruz anymore. But we know it was widely used. And so, we can infer that there were large stands of deergrass here historically. So these are the types of things that are still being discovered. The largest deergrass stand that we know of in California is actually at Pinnacles National Park. And the Amah Mutsun were part of research on that stand. So that's the best I can answer your question.
I don't know if this is a good last one, but speaking as part of a little cohort of volunteers here who work out at Cruz Valley, and hearing about the volunteer opportunities that you all presented, one of which seems pretty entry level and one of which seems very technically involved, in that you have to devote a good amount of time and there's a bit more risk there. You have to be physically fit. I wondered if you all would humble brag about what you're doing with young people in order to maintain and reserve and educate the next generation of volunteers and leaders in this.
I think Dylan probably has something to say about that.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the question is, excuse me, how are we specifically reaching out to younger demographics and maybe retaining interest in those demographics and get them coming back and so on and so forth. From the state parks perspective, I've anytime a community member signs up and joins the brush pile creation work days that we have, I do my very best to take down their contact information and then just start sharing more internal opportunities with them. We have a handful of docent enrichments that happen monthly and docent meetings and lots of fun saunters we do internally. And I sort of invite them to attend some of those things. And that's received a lot of positive response. So in regards to retention, I think providing additional educational opportunities, and if they're not, public educational opportunities, just availability to just hang out with a small like community and get out there in the field and go learn about this and that. Yeah, and in like those particular examples, that's usually, I think, actually almost always turned out with those folks then like wanting to sign up or become a formal volunteer and like get in the database. And so yeah, pretty cool.
Now maybe if I can jump into and say something like that.
I also just wanted to note that I think one of the things that the museum is trying to do is help people connect with these concepts in a way that's very approachable and accessible for them. So like these walks that we do, they're appropriate for whatever your entry point is for it. So if it's the first time you've ever heard about prescribed burns, or if you know nothing about fire ecology, it'll be a wonderful experience for you. But also we get people who have a lot of experience with these topics who come on these walks and also are able to get something out of them because you have these access to these experts who can help you wherever you're at. And I think I've seen firsthand young people who come on our programs, who come again and again, who develop a really amazing connection with our local natural environments and a deep interest in caring for nature. And so I think that, offering those types of experiences, and we're really grateful for the partners that we have in Dylan and in Ian and with all of these community groups who do partner with us on these programs to reach people who are maybe not necessarily ready for that volunteer experience yet. They haven't quite necessarily gotten to the point where they're like, yes, what can I do? But then also learning about these experiences so that, when they do feel that motivation, that there's something for them to move forward. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I also just wanted to say that you actually don't have to be super physically fit to participate in the prescribed burn opportunities. What you don't see here is that a lot of prescribed burns are done up against basically roads that are navigable with golf carts and other accessibility aids. And I participated in the Central Coast Treks, which was an amazing opportunity. And not only did we have people from all over the world, we had people of all ages joining in the treks. I think maybe it started at 18, but we had people who were definitely seniors participating in that opportunity. And we just accommodated, if you can't walk 2 miles to the firing point, we'll take you in a golf cart and you're an extra set of eyes on the fire line. And you can probably use a drip torch to light a little bit. So these opportunities are actually open to people of a wide range of physical abilities. And I just wanted to speak from my own experience on that and say that all really are welcome.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, how have these like recent wildfires affected like official, which I guess is to say like federal and state interest in permitting and funding these types of prescribed burns? And is it government regulation or is it like landowner skittishness that's kind of standing in the way of like a more robust prescribed burn culture? I mean, the San Vicente example was pretty extreme. It was 26 acres of 9,000. So just leave it there.
So the question is, what are some of the things standing in the way or opportunities also probably to build out prescribed burn programs and also more of the kind of fuels management work that we need going forward? I think it's a broad mix. I mean, their funding opportunities have definitely gone up. I think some of the fire years we've had in the last 5-10 years have really spurred that, particularly in California. Cal Fire has put out a lot of funding that has been crucial for a lot of the projects that I described there. But permitting costs, there's been a lot of efforts statewide. I know a number of the RCDs have participated in, whether it be like cutting green tape and passing things to deal with liability issues or, burn boss programs throughout the state. So I think things are starting to pick up speed on that, but a lot of these are very complex. Like communities in some of these areas can be very sensitive to this, recognizing just this potential impacts, but that's where the work that the PBAs and that Jared is doing is essential for getting that community buy-in. And then for larger land managers, it's, you know, tracking down the money to be able to do stuff, being able to tell the stories of what we're doing so people recognize why this stuff is necessary, what we're doing to accomplish this, because I think there can be reticence about whether it be cutting trees or just, you know, a lot of these projects look pretty raw after you do them, but it's recognizing that you're basically mimicking a disturbance regime, and the impacts of fire can look severe afterwards, but are really revitalizing to habitats that are adapted to that, really. So as far as, you know, hurdles to get over, we're trying to tackle one by one, and I think there's a lot of collaboration within this community and within the state for sure to try and be able to get through those so that we can reach the scale we need to actually make a dent in things. So
is there something that people can do, like, in terms of voting, calling, or like what if the community does have buy-in, can that help?
Yeah, I'll take a stab unless somebody else wants to. You know, so a lot of these things are connected, obviously, and it gets a little bit to what Larry was talking about like what is to be done. We have to, so the PBA, in my opinion, is almost like a volunteer fire department, but instead of fighting fire, it's lighting fire, right? But there's only so much you can do with volunteerism, right? It only goes so far. So we have to professionalize land management, land stewardship. We have to create programs within universities, within high schools. I mean, we work with 4-H groups. A lot of our participants are college students. I would love to see a land stewardship department at a, you know, university that's tackling all of this, you know, from the conservation grazing, you know, prescribed fire, appropriate forestry, you know, you kind of go down the list, right, of all the land management that needs to happen. You know, and what can people do? There's not like a particular bill out there right now that you can go write about. And that has come up in the past, and there's been a lot of change. I mean, that's been the silver lining of these big wildfires, is that it's, you know, essentially caused everyone to go, well, this doesn't work. So what do we need to be doing instead? But to kind of give perspective of how behind California is, Florida burns roughly 2 million acres a year. We're struggling as a state in California to get to 100,000, right? We're really behind. When I worked for Cal Fire, which was in the early aughts, prescribed fire was basically banned. The governor just said no prescribed fire, right? So we're really behind. You know, of course, we don't want to see big wildfires continue. But we also don't want everyone to fall asleep on this. So this summer's been really sleepy. Last summer was strangely very sleepy when it came to wildfires. Well, considering how drought stricken the state was, I think just people really tightened up on their, you know, accidental ignitions, and there was a lot more firefighters out there too. But we can't firefight our way out of this. We actually have to steward the land. Plus, there's the ecological component of it. You know, it's not just your house burning down. It's also, you know, do we want to see all of our oak woodlands turn into Doug fir forest? You lose diversity. Do you want to see all of your coastal prairie turn into Doug fir forest? You lose diversity. So that's a huge component. So I think, generally speaking, we need to be vigilant and supportive of figuring out how to professionalize this and create that ability, because right now it's not there. And everyone thinks that, for instance, Cal Fire is going to prescribe fire our way out of this. Cal Fire is busy doing other things. Traffic collisions, medical response, hazmat, and wildfires, you know, like they have a lot on their plate, and they do prescribe fire, and not to knock it, but to say, oh, they're just going to do that as well is not realistic.
Were you going to say something?
Sure.
perishable.
You know, just when you talk about the barriers, you know, in my experience working with the Amah Mutsun tribal band, one of the barriers is just the attitudes that we have around, you know, these ideas of wilderness. You know, when the Amah Mutsun wanted to burn the deer grass stand at Pinnacles National Park, there were objections because there's these ideas here that, you know, it's wilderness and it's God's creation, and, you know, human beings should not touch it. When the Amah Mutsun wanted to start cutting down Doug fir trees in Coroste Valley Cultural Preserve to start restoring the coastal prairie in that area, there was an environmental group that objected to that. So we got to change our attitudes, you know, change, you know, our perceptions of what the landscape is. And when we talk about stewardship, you know, that really kind of, you know, flies in the face of wilderness, because, you know, when you look at the Wilderness Act, it says wilderness is a place that is untrammeled by man, right? But if we start stewarding our lands, it ceases to become that idea of wilderness. So I think that these attitudes need to be changed, and we need to start thinking about stewardship and the promotion of biodiversity through, you know, disturbance regimes and things of that nature.
I think one thing that's really difficult, oh no, I'm good back. Is we all want this short-term fix to this, and our forests have taken a long time to get to where they are right now. And shaded field rights have to be maintained, and we're going to continue to do that. So I would assume over a longer period of time in your, and maybe you could speak to this, in your management, you're helping the forest get back to a place where it's sort of naturally suppressing things and able to, if a fire starts kind of in the larger scale, have maybe a lower intensity fire. But I do think that's a long-term thing, probably a lot of us here beyond our lifetime, but to embrace that we can't do it probably all at once, and to have a more sustaining, self-sustaining for us, that's gonna take just a long time, but we're gonna have to go a long way yet to get. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but we hear that a lot, like, in 10 years with all this money, it's gonna be fixed. And then maybe it'll be fixed for 5 years, and then 5 years from now, we're right back where we started again. So just thinking about the really big pictures.
Thank you, Angie. I think her point, to sum it up, was about the kind of short-term fix versus the longevity that's needed for long-term management of this. And that's crucial for a lot of what we're doing. I mean, the financial side is a tough one to picture, because I'm curious how many times you can fund the same project over and over if you keep asking money for the same fuel break. But that's core to what we're trying to do. And particularly on larger properties like San Vicente and this region, there's lots of, you know, smaller, not necessarily contiguous protected lands, but in these big areas, that's where you really have to restore the ecological processes as kind of a foundational part of this. So it's, when I'm talking about shaded fuel breaks along ridge lines, it's like that's step one to be able to reintroduce fire. So then we can use that as a management tool and essentially introduce that as the long-term stewardship plan. And that's essential to do. It's not, to your point, it's not a one-time fix. And that mentality, I think, could potentially, or is something that we have to dispel from the start. And it might be a tough pill for people to swallow, but I think to Jared's point about professionalizing this more, and to Rick's point about, you know, breaking through this past notion of wilderness, that's going to be essential to make sure that people recognize this is a forever thing. It was a forever thing for thousands of years pre-colonization, and that it needs to be kind of a core part of our relationship and our place in the environment ecosystem here.
And I think to that end, this goes back to things I was talking about in my presentation, and the ways that you can participate as an individual sometimes feel really small. But I remember a question earlier saying, okay, well, we know that Indigenous people, you know, burned in oak woodland, burned in redwood forest, burned in coastal grassland, but what about the landscape? How did they manage the landscape? That is the landscape. Each of those the landscape is a mosaic of connected ecosystems, and every time we do something in one of those ecosystems, we're having a landscape effect. Ecosystems are connected, and if you've ever seen a picture of those food webs, there's similar webs of relationships between different plants, between fungi, between animals. And seriously, every time we do something, we're having an ecosystem effect. So things you can do are attending those volunteer events that we talked about earlier, attending a prescribed fire, being involved in that, even though it can feel very individual and very small scale, is in a very real sense being involved in landscape management.
And I just want to be respectful of people's time. It's after 8. So I think we're going to wrap things up. Maybe some of the speakers will be able to stick around for a couple minutes. So if you want to continue to ask some questions, you can, mob them. That's fine. I'll also just remind you that I'm going to follow up with an email with a bunch of links. So I'll try to get as much information about the things that were shared here today as possible to share back with you, as well as hopefully this recording worked and we'll be able to share that with you as well. But I just want to thank you all for being here and being a part of this conversation and being a part of that cultural movement that we've been talking about of helping people see the benefits of this work. And I just want one last final moment of gratitude for these people and for their organization. There's a lot of really good work going on out there, and I think we all probably agree at this point that we want more of it. So thank you all for joining us tonight.